Buddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So, these previous few weeks we've been moving through the ninth discourse in the Middle Length Discourses, the Sammaditthi Sutta, or Right View, in which Venerable Sariputta speaks about three different frameworks, at least, for how we can hold right or harmonious view. How we frame and look at our lives and the causes of suffering so that we can let go of them. The first framework he uses is that of observing the wholesome and unwholesome paths of action and speech and thought which develop or corrupt the heart. The second is the nutriments, these sources of nourishment which we feed and exist and subsist on, how we can learn to understand them and develop wholesome sources in meditation and otherwise. The third framework, which is the one that today's talk deals with, is to do with a system of looking at how we create suffering called dependent origination, paticca samuppada, which is a series of 12 links that begin with ignorance and end with suffering. These links have their origin in avidya, and ignorance in the Buddhist context is ignorance of a skill, and namely the skill of applying the Four Noble Truths. It's a intelligence which we develop little by little, wherein we learn to, with an increasingly subtle and refined touch, take on or apply the tasks of the Four Noble Truths to comprehend and see dukkha, suffering, to let go of its cause, craving, to realize its cessation, peace, nibbana, and the fourth noble truth, to develop the path towards that cessation, the Noble Eightfold Path. And psychology shows that when human beings are clearly presented with the drawbacks and the benefits of a given action or state, they will often, if the drawbacks exceed the benefits, be able to let go of that thing. The issue is that we're so bad at judging the drawbacks versus the benefits of the things in our lives, largely because we're intoxicated with birth, with becoming, with the new. And you see this in so many areas, how while eating, the next mouthful is already on your mind, even as the last one is just entered the mouth. Or how in meditation, it's so hard to remain with a sense of calm, stilled centeredness, and we find ourselves proliferating around the next moment, what we'll do after meditation. I think people who have been on retreat know well the drive to think about what we'll do after retreat. I remember some retreats where we weren't allowed to read anything, and you just find yourself reading shampoo bottles, anything, you know. So when we don't have a clear vision, then we don't see the suffering in action, in intention. And we misjudge, and so we jump into suffering. The last thing you can take from people is their suffering. And as we begin to discern through our practice this feeling of craving, and how craving, thirst, tanha, leads to a trying to nourish and feed ourselves from outside, how this results in this sort of frenzy and buying into something. We see how that aspect of craving is unnecessary and always leads to suffering. And then it's not that we have to stop taking action in our lives, doing things. It's just that added element of becoming drunk on something, of taking on suffering, we can let go of little by little. And as we practice and gain sensitivity, we begin to move through life with a grace and a steadiness and a poise, restraint, where we're not craving so much that we're always feeding off of those things around us and becoming. Ajahn is known for a beautiful summary of the Four Noble Truths, where he says that suffering is caused by the mind going out of itself, looking outside of itself. The path to the end of suffering is the mind watching the mind. So this sense of the mind going out of itself, searching outside for nourishment and sustenance, is the essential element of what these 12 links of dependent origination point to. Ignorance leads to sankhara. Sankhara means many things, but its essential element is intention. It's the movement out. This leads to consciousness, which leads to name and form, which leads to the sense bases, which leads to sense contact, feeling, craving, becoming, birth, death, suffering. And this can seem like a really esoteric and confusing chain. Someone once asked Ajahn Chah if they needed to memorize all of dependent origination. And Ajahn Chah said, look, it's like you're falling from a tree and you're kind of counting every branch on the way down. It's enough just to know that when you fall out of a tree, it hurts and you hit the ground. But it's not to say that there's not real power in this model as well. Specifically, there's a few relevant points, or especially relevant points. One is the moment between feeling and craving. And this is the point where, when we feel attracted to something, when we feel averse towards something, or neutral, how instead of just letting that feeling arise and pass as a piece of old karma, because even arahants, enlightened beings, they'll have negative or pleasurable, unpleasant, and neutral feelings. The problem is when craving, tanha, comes into play, and suddenly we begin to grab on to that feeling, to crave. A famous palm reader once went to Ajahn Chah and asked to see his palm, and he looked at it and was baffled, and he said, "You have a lot of anger," and he was kind of afraid to say it. And Ajahn Chah said, "Yes, but I don't grab it. I don't take it. My ow." So these things exist, but the problematic link, or at least one of them, is when we take that feeling and feed off of it, become drunk on it, become colored by it, buy into it. Essentially, when we don't understand the drawbacks versus the benefits. Because it's very tempting to dive into the self-righteous feeling of anger. It's very tempting to let yourself go into the binge of Netflix. It's very tempting. And much of this practice is just bringing enough mindfulness and meditation in our lives that we begin to see the residual echoes of those actions and how the suffering remains and how it's not worth it. And eventually this even manifests in the midst of the action. There's a burning element to it that is not pleasant anymore. And you find suddenly that you don't like going to the party in the same way you used to. That what you value instead is just talking with someone you care about quietly, or something more gentle. The world that you used to inhabit begins to lose its color. But it's not replaced with nothing. It's not like the world just loses all of its color. Because when we step off of this wheel, this web, this spinning, what we step into is a sense of knowing it, of solidity, of centeredness of heart. There's a very interesting sutta called the Upanisa Sutta, where the Buddha says that whether or not a Tathagata, the Buddha, arises in the world, this remains: the stability of Dhamma, the fixedness of Dhamma, the not otherwiseness of Dhamma. Tatata avitatata ananyatata. And for me here, it's almost as if he's pointing to something that can't quite be articulated, but a stability. Even the Pali word tatata, it implies this sense of groundedness. And even as this cyclone, this vortex of whirling conditions surrounds us, and the world spins in line with this becoming, this ignorance, this craving, if we're able to step out of that into the center, into the calm eye of the storm, there's a sense we can exist even as these conditions whirl around us, and we can be untouched and compassionate and agile in the midst of it. So it's good on this, if there's one branch you can pick up on this fall from the top of the tree, perhaps one of the most useful is this branch of craving and feeling right at that moment. Can you notice the tendency to buy into something and stop yourself? And this process of becoming drunk on a mental state, a condition, a desire, is so important that the Buddha almost divides it into 3 separate steps of this cycle. There's craving, becoming, birth. And birth is, in a sense, the point of the most dopamine. If we take paticca-samuppada, dependent origination, as a psychological model of the present life, which it can be taken as. It's the moment of peak excitement. So they've done studies on people shopping, and birth is the moment right before you check out something at the cash register. That's your peak dopamine moment. So that's birth right there. And can you notice what it feels like to be at that moment, the fever? And then can you not ignore the fading after? Can you take that into account so that you can see the suffering also associated with letting your heart leave you and tie itself to something outside? Because then when those things break and fade, which they always do, the heart breaks too. The interesting other element of those 3 steps is the becoming and birth implications of that language. It's not, the flush of craving is one telltale sign when we're about to suffer. And often, I think Ajahn Sucitto said that, like when he feels himself buying into something, he'll just start repeating to himself, about to suffer, about to suffer. And another good articulation of mindfulness is a recollection of not quite yet, not quite yet. So these are both countermeasures to the flush. But the becoming is interesting too, because you feel when suddenly that intoxicating nucleus of feeling of you becomes very salient and seductive. Self-righteous anger is not a pleasant state of consciousness, but it creates a sense of self, of becoming, that's unbelievably solid. And that's what's so attractive about it. It orients us in the world. It gives us a place, orientation towards all those around us. And without that, we don't really know what to do. There's a beautiful poem. At the end of it, it says, it's of Sisyphus, and Sisyphus walking away from his stone, and how hard that is. And I think the last line is the immense strength it takes to walk away from a great weight you've been pushing your whole life. We know ourselves. We've defined ourselves by our suffering. That's our becoming. That's our nucleus. And it takes a long time for the steady glow and stability of Dhamma, of heart, of citta, of loving awareness to grow and for you to gain faith in it so that eventually you can rest in that. It's a bit like learning to swim, where after a few years you find you can lay out and the Dhamma, this water, will hold you. But for a long time, you find yourself holding a rock in your hand and trying frantically to splash around with the other and keep afloat. It takes a very special awareness and control and faith and patience to stop and to notice that there is something which will hold you. I was talking to someone this morning who was speaking about how their sense of friendship has changed, how he feels more connected with people in this group than he ever has with any other group of people. And yet how with the fruits of practice, every friendship seems somehow to be held lighter. There's an impersonal element to it. And how in a worldly sense, this is almost monstrous. And yet I find the same thing. The friendship which we cultivate in the practice, it's almost as if how 2 strings on the same note, when one is plucked, the other resonates in the same frequency. We're all walking parallel, and so we all walk with each other, but there's not the same, it's not based on if each of our personalities meshes perfectly well with the others. It's not based on these fragile conditions of who we like and who we don't like. And there's something very sticky over time about after you've been practicing, saying things like my best friend or something. It just doesn't feel right anymore. We're asked and called to something more than that. We're asked to a greater love. And whenever we see those individual people or entities completely eclipsing that greater love, we know we need to be where. And not that we can't love other people and have spouses and relationships, but these are always means towards touching a greater love. And a very good sense of when we've slipped and allowed our vision to constrict is when that sense of becoming and craving come back into the picture. When the sense of self needing to be in the relationship, validated by the relationship. When you need them to care about you just this way, this much, and show it like this. You know you've become. You know you slipped into suffering, and you're feeding off of them again. And then you can just repeat to yourself, about to suffer, about to suffer. What's very interesting too, the end link in this chain of dependent origination is sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair. And it's very interesting to watch as those latter words fade. I remember several years into monastic life, I realized the word despair just didn't apply anymore. Things still sucked plenty, you know? They were still like annoying, unpleasant, really difficult. But as we lighten our grip on the khandhas, the aggregates, the personality, the body, these changeable things, you just can take the world lighter. And a good measure of practice is if more things are making you happy and less things are making you suffer. Ajahn Sona says that within 5 years of dedicated practice, you can expect to be about 50% happier. What's the app name? Is it like 10% happier? Yeah, so we beat that by like 5 times, so it's good. What's beautiful about this sutta, first, the 12 links of dependent origination is far too much to go into completely now. Ajahn Sucitto has a several-week meditation course titled Beginning Dependent Origination for Advanced Meditators, which I think is slightly tongue-in-cheek and slightly not. But it's perhaps the most profound piece of psychology I think that's ever been articulated. And in Bodh Gaya, you'll hear the monks chanting it under the Bodhi tree in Pali, back and forth and back and forth. It was the Buddha's seminal insight, how suffering is created. And in the Sammaditthi Sutta, Sariputta says that right view is that when you see any of these links within the framework of the Four Noble Truths, it dismantles the whole process. So when you see birth, the origination of birth, the cessation of birth, and the way leading to the cessation of birth, and the same with becoming, craving, contact, all these things, then you relinquish obsession with desire and aversion and the conceit I am. And what is the origination of, say, birth? It's becoming. What is the origination of becoming? It's craving. And he moves all the way back through the chain. So what's meaningful here is that wherever you are on that chain, because we don't always catch ourselves in time. Sometimes you find the horse is well out of the stable and you're galloping along, 3 donuts into 12 or something, I don't know. And it's not too late for you. If you apply the Four Noble Truths at any link, it dismantles the whole process and it disintegrates. Specifically, if you see not just how it came into being, but how you can let it fade, and specifically how you let go of the obsession with aversion and attachment at that moment, the conceit I am, that clinging to these moments of becoming, of craving, because we're excited, we buy into every one of these links, because we don't know what would be there if we didn't. And yet, as we get a feel for what happens with stepping off of that into a sense of peace, that's the third noble truth applied to each, realizing cessation, realizing peace. There are a few ways to hamstring the process, to cut off this moment between craving and becoming, between becoming and birth, between birth and death, or simply to relinquish the attachment, the drunkenness on any specific moment. And part of this is realizing the ending. Realizing the fading and fragile nature of each one. And this is in a sense, this is looking to the very end of the whole chain and seeing that this birth ends in death. If you get drunk today, you know that tomorrow the hangover will come. If you allow yourself to blow up at this person right now, you know you're going to regret it. Or if you follow this little fantasy in meditation, you know you'll just have that sense of wasted time, of a niggling feeling like you've not been doing what you need to do now with this moment. So you don't do it. And this is where the recollection of death is so helpful. It allows us to keep the whole cycle in our heads at all times, to see where each of these things ends, and to allow that to separate the chaff from the grain, and to put things in perspective. And when we find ourselves at an impasse in our practice, because Ajahn Chah said that 80% of the practice is knowing you should let go of something and not being able to, bringing to mind death every day and remembering what is worthy in light of that is an essential thing to do. It's the main piece of advice my teacher would give to people considering but not completely settled on ordination. Another good thing is if you find that you're really having fun with this whole birth process of becoming, of craving, fantasizing about this or that, and you can't just stop the thought. Instead, you can tag on an addendum to it. So at the end of let yourself go through the verbalization like, I would just, I can't wait to get out of here and go to the pizza place. Just add on, and that's anicca, and that's impermanent. I would love to go to the pizza place, and that's impermanent. Just every single thought, add it on, because it's a lot easier sometimes than cutting off the thought. Another thing you can do is, this works especially well if there's like something you really keep buying into, like, I just wish I could tell that person off, or do this, or if this one problem resolved. When you find yourself about to be born into that thought world again, just say very clearly to yourself, and then I would be happy forever. And see if you can still take yourself seriously. If that person would stop chewing so loudly, I would be happy forever. And another way is just slow down the thought very, just say it really clearly, crisply, put it on stage, It's one thing if the hecklers are kind of mumbling in the back, but make them get on stage and say, why won't that person stop breathing so loudly? Then I would be able to meditate, and then I would be happy forever. Just slow it down. So these are ways of pointing out the absurdity, and this is how you can stop yourself from being born into that next thought world. These links of dependent origination they're a means for the Buddha to speak about how we move from life to life. Our ignorance creates this intentional movement out, and we take birth, and then we become, and we pass away. And that's the horizontal way of looking at it. But then there's the vertical way, which is, how is that manifesting right now in this moment? What world are we born into? And another very significant feature of these 12 links is that quite a few of them happen before sensory contact. Ignorance, intentional formations, sankhara, consciousness, name and form, sense bases, then contact, then feeling. And all this is to say that when we finally encounter the world, we already come primed and seeking for something. We're already very ready to find ourselves born into a certain world before we've ever been touched by the external world. And so many of the worlds we inhabit through our days are not the result of these external circumstances being a certain way. This helps us take responsibility, because depending on what mood we're in, how we wake up, then we can very easily find our every single sense impression, what we fixate on being what's annoying us and what's making us feel disheartened, angry, frustrated, or what's making us crave, or what's just making us bored. And tracking this back, taking responsibility and acknowledging that it's not your loved one, it's not the guy next to you, it's you. And that you can alter that through meditation, through working with intention, sankhara. And even further, tracking it back to ignorance and to not seeing clearly. And how this moving out, sankhara, moving into the world to seek sustenance, to seek fulfillment, it's trying to fill up a hole that it can never fill from the outside. The mind seeking outside of itself is the cause of suffering. And can we, sometimes exactly what you need is to track back that birth right to the initiating wound. This is the beauty of the Buddha raising up suffering and craving as such a cornerstone of the teaching, is that he said all things meet at feeling. So all the grumpy states you find yourselves in the morning, all the greed, all this, sometimes one of the most powerful things to do is just trace it back to this scared, hungry child at the center of each of us that has been trying so long, so hard to just be happy and secure and has not found it yet. And how can you not have sympathy and care for that part of us? Sometimes that's how we dismantle this whole world. There's been a very interesting proliferation in pop culture recently around multiverse movies, I hear. So I think there's one I saw an ad for called Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. Who's seen that? How many? Anyone? One. All right. At least. It's all right. I would see it if I was a layperson, probably, I'm sure. But it's interesting, this obsession with the multiverse that our culture now has. What does that mean? That we're so fractured that it's playing out in this collective dream we have in the movies. And however colorful that multiverse of the Marvel world is, Buddhist cosmology has something pretty equal. We have the Asura realms, which are the sort of angry titans. We have the jealous gods. We have the animal realm, which is hunger and fear. We have the hungry ghosts, just craving, longing for something you cannot get. We have the heaven realms of carelessness. We have hell. We have a human realm, which is a mixture of compassion, difficulty, pain, care, mindfulness, wisdom, all these things. So can we see which world we're allowing ourselves to be born into? How often are we existing in this state of a hungry ghost, longing over what we can't have? The career, the love. How often are we in this state of anger, of sort of gnawing over the same bone, this sense of hell in a sense of just continual burning? Or have we become complacent with comfort? This is the problem of the Deva realms, the angelic realms, is people become careless and we forget. And when we sense that becoming, when we sense that we've become colored by a world, can we notice, can we let go, and can we step out of that swirling, circling wheel into a still center of the heart that begins to grow and become stronger little by little as we practice? And so much of this practice for the first few years is just watching the chitta, the mind-heart strengthen little by little and become strong, stable, and bright. And then when we let go of that constant motion, we have a place to land. I don't know how the movie ends with Doctor Strange, but maybe there's some sort of dharmic resolution metaphor there. Rick, you can tell me later. Sorry. Okay. Anyways, I wish you all the best. Sorry I called you out there. Sorry. If I was a layperson, there's a good chance I would have seen that movie. I had a soft spot for Marvel. So, we have a chance for some questions and topics of discussion if people have them. Kyle?
I think about what you kind of alluded to it for a second was you mentioned just in passing like the right and harmonious path. It kind of implies that the right path is in a sense harmonious, but can you just elaborate more on what else the right path has going for it other than harmony?
What do you mean has going for it? So the question is, I referenced the right or harmonious path, and what exactly does that imply besides a sense of harmony? So specifically, I was referencing that in line with the fourth noble truth, so developing the Noble Eightfold Path. And every factor of that path is defined in detail, but the prefix to every single word is sama, which means correct, right? But it also means harmonious. So right view is views of the Four Noble Truths on a transcendent level, and then there's a mundane right view around karma, rebirth, etc., the existence of enlightened beings. There's right intention towards non-ill will, non-harmfulness, renunciation. Then there's right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right concentration, or right mindfulness and right concentration, which is the four jhanas. And so every one of those factors is defined like in quite a bit of detail. I think the word, I raise up the aspect of Samma as harmonious because I think it's helpful in getting us away from the more Judeo-Christian influenced connotations of right with a capital R. And it's true that the Buddha was very clear there is a correct path and an incorrect path in terms of what you want to come to with the enlightened heart and what's sort of correct. But I just find people it's one of the great tragedies of seeing people really embark on this path and how people can really tie themselves up into knots and become kind of jerks trying to just be good people, you know? Like, you can really hold that ideal up in a way that gets problematic. And so it's just nice to remind people every now and again that if there's a sense of strong disharmony, the odds are something may be off. That being said, one interesting thing about beginning to step onto this path is there is a sense of not really playing the same music anymore as the people who you were with before. And so there is a sense of discord there a little bit, but it's internally, for me, there's this sense of kind of resonance and deepening resonance. So I love the word Samma. Yeah. Does that answer a bit?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
My understanding and experience is that another way to interrupt the cycle of dependent origination is to notice whether something is pleasant or unpleasant.
So the Judith was just saying that one way she's also found to interrupt the cycle of dependent origination is to notice when something is pleasant or unpleasant. Yeah. Yeah, one beautiful, I recently stumbled across this fourfold framework called the Sources of Power for Mindfulness. I think it's by Nyanaponika. One use is ordering things by labeling. The other is non-coercive procedure. The third is seeing directly. And the fourth is, I forgot the fourth, I just learned this. But cleaning things up by labeling, I find it's absolutely true. And I think you can do that at almost any of those steps you can do it at. Like with the 6 sense bases, just seeing, you know, like labeling it or feeling, yeah, pleasant, craving. I think you're right. It makes it more of an object of consciousness you can put in its proper place. If others have skillful means they've found of working with all this stuff, please, you know, feel free to speak up as well. Which realm do people find themselves in the most, by the way? Deva, Asura, animal, hungry ghost? Okay, it's all right.
All those realms seem to like kind of have a lot of drawbacks. Just not, if you do more in those mistakes to begin with, you need more and that's all right.
So one of the questioners pointed out astutely that all those realms seem like they have quite a lot of drawbacks. And is there any kind of winning game in this whole thing? In the Mahadukkha Kanda Sutta, the Buddha compares each realm. He says, hell realms are like, and you can take this psychologically largely if you want, if it's helpful. Hell realms are like a pit of coals. The animal realm is like a cesspit. The animal realm is like a sort of bare tree on a sunny day trying to get into the shade. The human realm is a lush tree, the shadow of a lush tree on a sunny day. The heavenly realms are a mansion. So we find ourselves, this is the shady tree. It's still pretty difficult, isn't it? Yeah, and I think it's helpful to recollect that present moment experience is what is significant, and you have beings who exist in this realm with a huge measure of love and levity, and in a lot of senses it might be a shady tree in that case. But there's this really amazing book called Cave in the Snow. Who's read that? So it's amazing. It's this woman named Tenzin Palmo, one of the most senior Tibetan bhikshunis, and she meditates 10 years in a cave. 3 of those years she doesn't lie down. Just amazing practitioner. And she has this vision at one point in her practice where she sees this huge jail, and in the bottom level there's all these people being kind of tortured, and then you have the middle place, which is all, people kind of in this sort of normal state, and then the upper levels are all these people having this party, but they're all in this prison together. So that was the Buddha's great insight, is that as long as there's this aspect of becoming and conceit of self, we're trapped at some level. So we do make it as good as we can, and we use it as a tool, but we don't seek refuge in it, and we try to hold it lightly and let go of the craving associated. Yeah. And then what we come to when we let go of it, it's beyond words. It's nibbana. You going to say? Sorry.
Yeah. I really appreciated the guided meditation. It was timely. And when you were describing what kind of leading us through that, imagining this could be our last day, this could be our last breath, I simultaneously felt like the pleasant, liberating potential of that, that awareness and fear. And that's not a new experience, the fear that's in the gut. And I could label it, I could see it, but I'm curious how to stay with it, stay with it skillfully, without getting lost in it.
So the questioner brought up during the guided meditation on death, there was a sense of clarity and brightness, but also of this sense of fear. And it's not the first time that's come up, and how do we relate to that and be with it? The Buddha gives a lot of tools, and they have to be used carefully and judiciously. So death contemplation, I think, can be really, it's just such a powerful way of using the thinking mind to stop thinking completely. My teacher couldn't stay with the breath for his first years of meditation, so his main object was death contemplation for 4 years. Life is uncertain, death is certain. And it just keeps you right here. And I find it just has this ability to cut things and to put things in a lot of perspective. If it's leading too much to this sense of fear, though, then it can be good to let go for a sense of metta and stuff. You don't want to force yourself into a dark place. At the same time, it also is worth investigating if, I've talked about the moment that my college years were good. I was doing social work, I was living a good life, and I knew that I wanted more and that I wasn't doing enough. I knew where my life was, there was more that needed to happen, and I wasn't in line with that. It was sort of like a ship tacking into the wind, and you're always approaching what you know is worthwhile, but never directly and never enough. And that ate at me, and I think it's worth noting if a clear look at death makes that internal compass, makes you feel how it's digging into you if you're not oriented completely with it, and I think sometimes that fear, it's just something that fades over time, or maybe something you don't want to dive too deep into right now. The practice, only really the arahants are really ready for death. But also I think it is worth noticing if it's a bit of an answer to the question of am I living a life worthy of my death, and what would that life be? But I don't know if that's the case. It's just a lot of stuff comes up with that contemplation, you know. And I think really holding the, remembering this refuge we're part of, like the Dhamma is real. It's unbelievably powerful, the karma we're creating, the goodness that this path brings into the world. And when we let go of all those other elements, it's not like there's nothing left, you know. There's this thing we're all part of together, this goodness. And I think that just takes a while to get a lot of faith in, and I think it helps to go to monasteries and meet beings who maybe are enlightened too. It kind of gives you a bit of a taste of it, so I don't know. Did other people have interesting experiences with that contemplation that they'd be willing to share?
Yeah, for me, I think the talk was really relevant and timely for me too. Just thinking about how, depending on who you talk to, I'm a first or second generation Cambodian American, and the experience of that, you don't know who you are. Our history was quite kind of wiped out, or not wiped out, but we don't know who we are, basically. That's what I'm saying. Anyways, I got to a point in my life where I was trying to understand what happened, and the more that I looked into that part of our history, the more I kind of identified myself with the tragedy that happened. And as I attached myself to that part of history, I found myself to be overwhelmed with anger, with sadness, even bitterness and revenge. And even though I personally never experienced it, I had these feelings, yet I realized that there was more to life than this feeling of anger, this feeling of bitterness and revenge. Like, what was the point of me knowing this part of our history? And it led me to have this desire or intuition to want to find peace, because I kind of told myself that, again, there's more to life than this chaos that had happened. And so, growing up, my mother always went to the Buddhist temple and found refuge there, and so I kind of followed in her path, and I decided one day I was going to start going to our local Khmer temples too. And it was there where I found the path to, not found the path to peace, but I found out the Buddha had the teachings to find peace. I found peace, but not like Nirvana. But I just realized that it's just that kind of like that word, synchronicity of it all, too, where there's that underlying intuitive feeling that I have that led me to this place. And when you say to like find a place to soft landing, it's like I finally found that soft landing. Yeah, here in this practice.
So Jenny was just sharing how initially when she learned about her past, there was the cultural, historical past of your people, like there's a lot of suffering and attachment to that, and then just kind of finding a refuge and different sense of identity and landing in the Buddhist path. I think that's a really, I can't relate to that level of, my history has been, Anglo-Saxon and all that. What I can relate to is that to expect ourselves to be able to just step off that wheel of becoming into the sense of peace and groundedness that doesn't need structure is impossible, as far as I know, until we're enlightened. Like, we are being reborn into a world, and this is the wheel we're on. And so making it a good world, and this is why the props are so helpful, why like the community is so helpful, is like just making sure that we're, you try to let go of that sense of craving, becoming when possible. But if we are going to go somewhere on a Saturday morning, then, this is the place to be. And the Buddha created a whole culture around it. He really did. Jenny, is there anything on the live stream, Katie, or should we call it a day?
Someone was just asking if there's any good book recommendations on the Noble Eightfold Path.
That was the question.
Is there a good book recommendation on the Noble Eightfold Path? There's a book called The Noble Eightfold Path. it's by Bhikkhu Bodhi, and it's a classic. It's a teeny book, but it's brilliant. So I'm not going to repeat the title on that one because I think you got it. It's very good though.